As one of the survivors of that famous battle, I believe that I was the youngest soldier who took part, being barely 14 years of age. Yet its details, horrors, and incidents are as freshly imprinted on my memory today as though but a week had rolled past since. On that day, to my youthful imagination and enthusiasm, we had the most formidable and powerful army on earth. And I greatly wondered at the foolhardy audacity of the rebels in daring to give us battle. On my left, I noticed a soldier in blue uniform lying on the grass. The soldier was dead. He was the first I ever saw. His comrades had swept on and left his body to fill a nameless soldier's grave. How cruel and heartless it seemed.
With his election to the presidency in 1860, Abraham Lincoln pledged to stop the growth of slavery by prohibiting its expansion into the new Western territories. His election stoked a wildfire that had been smoldering for decades across the South, causing 7 states to secede from the Union in protest and form the Confederate States of America.
The feeling of unrest and uneasiness became intense in the South. The older and more thoughtful were filled with apprehension and gloom, but the younger and the thoughtless were filled with zeal and enthusiasm, encouraged by the belligerent tone of the Southern press and speakers.
Ready!
On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, starting the American Civil War. President Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. 4 more Southern states seceded from the Union, while 4 more debated their future Union ties: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Though it sat on the farthest reaches of civilization, it was prized by both sides for its great rivers, crucial for moving goods and people, as well as its complex network of rails which linked the states. Hemp, principally for making rope and baling cotton, was its bumper crop. And like the rebellious states, Missouri citizens had the right to own slaves. Yet, by a 70,000 majority, its male residents had recently voted to remain in the Union. But Missouri's loyalty was by no means certain.
The state government of Missouri was in the hands of those who sympathized with the states which had determined to sever the bonds of union. And no one with any foresight could fail to see that unless some active steps were taken by those of us who favored the Union cause, our state also would soon be carried into the Southern Confederacy.
Forward, march!
As spring dawned in 1861, an unknown Army captain fresh from Bleeding, Kansas, would force many Missourians to choose a side. Nathaniel Lyon, a 42-year-old Connecticut native and West Point graduate, had a hot temper. Leading U.S. troops in Kansas Territory during the Border War, he had developed a sharp hatred for slaveholders.
It is no longer useful to appeal to reason but to the sword. I shall not hesitate to rejoice at the triumph of my principles, though this triumph may involve an issue in which I certainly expect to expose and very likely lose my life. We shall rejoice, though in martyrdom if need be.
Lyon's friend, Francis P. Blair, a noted Missouri power broker, shared his zeal. And through this connection, Lyon was given the defense command of the Federal Arsenal in St. Louis, the fourth largest stockpile of military weapons in the Union, and the largest in all the slave states. Both believed the fate of Missouri could hinge on who controlled this fortress. Pushing the limits of military and constitutional law, Captain Lyon raised his own volunteer army to protect it. Many of those who joined him were Germans who had fled the revolutions in Europe, only to find themselves in a new one. They spoke little English and were cruelly mocked by the locals.
Since we Germans at the time were looked upon as belonging to an unworthy nation, and Americans old and young looked upon us with contempt and disdain, I would enlist in the Northern Army and stick to the Union.
Otto Lautermann, a Prussian, was one such man.
The lower element of citizens, mostly German-American, had not been idle. Everywhere in the city, secret clubs had been organized and were drilling.
These outcasts were right for Lyon, who was himself an outsider, a man of contradictions. He was a religious skeptic, a self-proclaimed infidel, but his love of the Union bordered on zealotry. He shunned military decorum and carried a rusty sword, yet he was a strict taskmaster in the army. He could be passionate, brutal. He had been court-martialed for beating a soldier, and in California in 1850, he had presided over the massacre of 100 Homo natives, retribution for killing a white man. But Lyon's strong will, his desire for swift retribution, also inspired great loyalty from those who wanted to stamp out secession in Missouri. None more than Franz Sigel. Sigel came from Baden, spoke 5 languages, and, it was said, had commanded 30,000 men in the German Revolution. In St. Louis, he led a different army, hundreds of students and teachers as the city's superintendent of schools. But when war broke out, he helped to raise volunteers for Lyon and became his most trusted advisor. Together, they built a defense force in a matter of weeks, which Lyon had declared by military decree to be the only legal militia in the state, a move backed by Blair and President Lincoln. Lyon was now able to target the Missouri State Militia, a volunteer army of 700, which in early May had gathered just 4 miles from the St. Louis Arsenal, and tauntingly flew the secessionist flag. They were due to muster out on May 11th, but before that could happen, Lyon hoped to make an example of them. And on a spring day in May 1861, he would set in motion events that would start Missouri on a path to become one of the most violent theaters in the American Civil War. On May 10th, 1861, Lyon and Sigel marched with an army of 8,000, intent on disbanding the Missouri State Militia, encamped within an hour's march of the Arsenal. They moved in broad daylight as hundreds gathered to watch.
The future commanding general of the U.S. Army, Ulysses S. Grant, was a citizen spectator, as was my future corps commander, General William T. Sherman, leading his oldest boy Thomas by the hand. Thus, by a very strange coincidence, the 2 greatest generals of the Union Army were spectators of my first military exploit.
Outnumbered 10 times over, the entire Missouri State Militia surrendered. His army fired not a single shot, But Lyon was no match for a horse. What happened next is disputed. Some say Lyon was only stunned. Others argued he was knocked out for hours. What is known is his volunteers held their position with the entire Missouri State Militia their captives. And as they waited, a crowd of angry onlookers grew, demanding the release of the militiamen and hurling ethnic slurs at the German soldiers, followed by heavier things. By the time Lyon reined in his troops, 28 were dead, including 2 teenage children and an infant still in its mother's arms. Lyon marched on, leaving the dead and the wounded behind. To the New York Times, he later said, "If innocent men, women, and children whose curiosity placed them in a dangerous position suffered with the guilty, it is no fault of the troops." The St. Louis Massacre, or the Camp Jackson Affair as the event became known, prompted the Missouri legislature to give its pro-Confederate governor, Claiborne Jackson, sweeping military powers and created the Missouri State Guard, a legal state-sanctioned militia. Its purpose was to protect Missouri from invasion, but its ranks drew heavily from the region to the north dubbed Little Dixie for its strong pro-Southern sentiments. By mid-May, divisions of Missouri State Guardsmen were organizing across the state.
A wonderful reaction has been taking place with our people. Thousands are now secessionists who were but a few short months ago for the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of laws. Conquer or die is our motto.
Their leader was a well-known Missouri politician and Mexican war hero, Sterling Price. Before the war, he had worked hard to keep his state in the Union. Now, he found himself increasingly at odds with Lyon, who now was a general and interim commander of all Union forces in the state. Lyon believed this included the Missouri State Guard. Price and Jackson resisted, asserting the state's right to control its own militia. In a June meeting at the Planters House Hotel in downtown St. Louis, negotiations fell apart as the general angrily threatened Price and Governor Jackson.
Rather than concede to the state of Missouri for one single instant the right to dictate to my government in any matter, however unimportant, I would see every man, woman, and child in the state dead and buried. This means war.
Wasting no time, Lyon split his army and sent a column under Sigel to Rolla to secure the rail and telegraph lines, while the remainder traveled up the Missouri River by steamboat, a first in the Civil War. 4 days later, Lyon occupied the state capital and installed a new pro-Union governor. But Governor Jackson had escaped upriver with some 400 state guardsmen to the fairgrounds outside Boonville. It was here that these two strange armies met for the first time. One sanctioned by the Constitution defied federal will. The other broke nearly every rule, was practically Lyon's private army, but dedicated to keeping Missouri's Union bonds strong. But Sterling Price had fallen ill, and an inexperienced Governor Jackson took command. It was a disaster. Lyon's well-drilled artillery quickly sent the state guardsmen into a retreat in what would be dubbed the Boonville Races. They fled south toward Lamar, merging along the way with two more divisions from Lexington. Price had regained his strength and rode further in the hopes of finding aid from the only people he knew who could give it: the Confederates. In just 30 days, Lyon's aggressive actions had secured Union control of Missouri's rivers and railroads. He had cut off Price's army from northern Missouri and Little Dixie, and he had scattered the rebellious elements of the Missouri state legislature. But he was not content. He wanted to disband this army that dared to defy him. And ambitious Franz Sigel was all too willing to oblige. Having already seized Rolla and Springfield, Sigel moved west, hoping to cut off the Missouri State Guard's retreat. But thanks to their earlier rendezvous with Price, the Missouri State Guard now outnumbered Sigel 4-1. And at a small creek near Carthage on July 5th, Sigel was forced into an embarrassing retreat to Springfield, where his army merged with Lyon's advancing column a week later. The Missouri State Guard continued south to Cowskin Prairie, where Price would mold them into a bona fide army.
Events were crowding thick and fast all over the country. Skirmishes and battle rumors filled the air. Our troops had met and defeated the enemy at Carthage, and the reports set me afire. So I bid goodbye to the love folks at home and traveled south to Price's army.
Lyon's hardline actions over the past few months compelled many Missouri men to risk their lives for the Southern cause. Thomas Bacon, a 22-year-old from Hannibal, Missouri, didn't have to fight. He was born to a wealthy family and was studying law. But his strong pro-Southern upbringing and the horror of the St. Louis massacre convinced him to give it all up. For 14 days, Bacon traveled by foot more than 200 miles to join Price's army, evading federal troops and local Union Home Guard almost the entire route. In May, Arkansas had formally joined the Confederacy, and on the northern border, 5,000 rebels camped but a few miles from Price's Missourians. Young Omer Weaver of Arkansas was one of them. He had left a promising job to serve as second in command on the Pulaski Battery, much to his mother's despair. And there was Annie, the girl he had been secretly courting. Only his mother knew of the relationship, and each letter Annie received from Omer, she burned after reading. Distance seemed to matter little when it came to Missouri. Louisiana contributed a regiment under Louis Hebert. Texans turned out too, forming a unit under Elkanah Greer, dubbed the South Kansas Texas Cavalry, though there were no Kansans to be found in their ranks.
Recruits were coming in every day, regiments, companies, and individuals. Old gray-headed men came in armed with their old squirrel rifles to help the boys whip the Yankees when the fight came off.
These men were the combined forces of Confederate Brigadier General Benjamin McCulloch. A former Texas Ranger, he doubted the fighting abilities of Price and his ragtag Missouri State Guardsmen. But a Confederate Missouri was enticing. The rivers and rails could open new supply lines, as well as fresh recruits. It offered a greater control of the future Oklahoma Territory, maybe even Kansas. And it was a good wall for Arkansas.
We must meet and rally the forces of Missouri, or the frontiers of Arkansas will give way. I shall raise every man I can in this state and turn this invading tide back.
At Cassville on July 29th, McCulloch successfully merged with Price's army, and together with the Arkansans of General N.B. Pierce, they formed the Western Army, 12,000 strong. But Lyon had his own band of dedicated fighters, with more coming as he had marched to Springfield to meet Sigel. At the core of his army was 600 professional soldiers led by West Point officers, known as regulars. They didn't count on the volunteers to fight when the shooting started. But many in his 2 volunteer Kansas regiments had seen plenty of combat in the 1850s border war against Missouri. George Deitzler, commander of the 1st Kansas, had even been a gun runner and was briefly imprisoned by pro-slavers on charges of treason.
There are about 800 men here, all eager to be mustered in and sent down south, where they will have a chance to burn a little powder in the defense of their country. Should they ever get a chance at the secessionists, they will show them that Kansas boys know how to fight.
Others, mere boys like Robert Friedrich of Topeka, Kansas, had stepped beyond their pastures and county limits for the first time and found themselves searching for guidance in what would be a life and death struggle. Lyon also had a volunteer regiment of spirited young Iowans, dubbed the Greyhounds, both for the color of their uniforms and their blistering pace on the march. They were diverse: Germans, Irish, Scot, Welsh, Canadian, Swedish, and French, to name a few. They carried handmade flags, proudly displaying their allegiance not only to their country, but the communities that had given them a home. And still others joined for the same reason as Weaver and Bacon, and made the same personal sacrifices. Levant Jones of Olathe, Kansas, left a young wife behind.
We expect a desperate battle, but shall whip them beyond any doubt. I may fall, and so falling never meet you again. If it shall be my fate to fall, to die in the defense of my beloved country and of its noble principles, I can die contented.
But others soon found limits to their patriotism. Most were volunteers who had promised to fight for 3 months. By midsummer, those 3 months were at an end. They could go home and rightfully say they did their duty, and many did. Lyon's army shrank to less than 6,000. Those who stayed soon wondered if they made the right choice.
We had no blankets, no knapsacks, no great coats, rotten white belts, and cartridge cases without tin racks.
In his trek through Missouri to find Price and the Missouri State Guard, Lyon's men covered more ground that summer than most armies did in the entire war. In one 30-hour span, they marched 50 miles, going without sleep, trekking along dusty farm roads with few trees to give relief from the scorching sun.
On Saturday, we moved our camp 14 miles. The day was terribly hot, and 3 men died on the way from the effects of the heat.
Food for Lyon's army grew scarce, and many lived for days on half rations or less. When they weren't on the march, they encamped at Springfield, a city whose people were staunchly pro-Union. July passed into August without a major fight, And for the first time, those close to Lyon saw something in him they had never seen before: doubt. The latest intelligence relayed by telegraph, another first in warfare, suggested he was badly outnumbered. He had recently been demoted as Union commander in Missouri, replaced by politically connected and popular General John C. Fremont, who now wanted some of Lyon's regulars for the fight in the East. And with the embarrassing Union defeat at Bull Run, Virginia, the pressure for a victory was upon him. Meanwhile, in the Price and McCullough, the Western Army had learned to adapt to conditions where supply lines were few and far between.
We had all kinds of arms except up-to-date Army guns. We had squirrel rifles, shotguns, and occasionally an old musket that had probably been used in the Mexican War 16 years before.
They lived off the land and marched on their stomachs, as Napoleon might say, and it was 12,000 empty bellies that led them into a valley 10 miles southwest of Springfield. Crops and livestock were plentiful: corn, oats, wheat, sweet potatoes, to name a few. There were 250 hogs here and 100 head of cattle. In a year, the farms yielded a ton of butter and 300 pounds of honey. A meandering water source also provided relief for the men and animals during that dry, hot August. But for the people living around Wilson Creek, the land and their lives would never be the same. John and Roxana Ray farmed 440 acres in the valley surrounding Wilson's Creek. Though slaveholders, like many in southwest Missouri, the Rays were decidedly pro-Union. As the area's United States postmaster, John Ray's farm straddled the Wire Road, a major highway across southwest Missouri. In the coming battle, this road would deliver war's tragedy to their front porch. Down the road, Joseph Sharp was living a nightmare. He was one of the wealthiest farmers in the area, with 1,000 acres of farmland and 3 slaves to work it. Now he and his fellow farmers had become unwilling hosts to 12,000 rebels and militiamen. And in a few more days, he and his fellow farmers would be doctors and grave diggers as well.
Wilson's Creek afforded us water, and the black oak trees and bushes furnished us with wood, while the surrounding hills provided grass for our horses. After the night's darkness had enveloped the earth, the 1,000 fires from the adjacent hills and valleys shot forth their light like so many stars in the canopy of the sky.
But others worried this peaceful valley would lull them into complacency and seal their doom.
As soon as our army camped on Wilson's Creek, the local Unionists made themselves thoroughly acquainted with our position and numbers and the exact location of our outposts. General Lyon knew more about ourselves than we did.
Lyon knew he was outnumbered, at least 2 to 1, and believed an attack on Springfield was only a matter of time. He began sending requests to General Fremont for reinforcements, and though he had 50,000 fresh soldiers at his command, Fremont sent none. It became increasingly clear that if Lyon did not pull back to his supply base in Rolla, he risked his whole army. Lyon feared retreating. The Southerners' large mounted force could surround or cut off his long lines of men on foot. Abandoning the region's pro-Union civilians to the Confederates didn't sit well with him, and leaving without a fight didn't suit his character. Franz Sigel, eager to prove himself and his Germans, came with a solution. He proposed dividing Lyon's outnumbered army and attacking the Southern force from 2 directions. their armies would march at night and launch a surprise attack at dawn, August 10th, a Saturday, leaving their opponent reeling and hopefully buying time to safely move to Rolla. The plan would be brilliant if successful, disastrous if it failed. Coincidentally, McCulloch and Price had given orders for their army to attack Lyon on the same day. But Mother Nature had interfered. Unlike Lyon's men, most of the Southerners lacked cartridge boxes for their paper-wrapped ammunition. The march was postponed to keep gunpowder dry, but in a crucial oversight, Price and McCulloch did not post sentries along the camp's edge. If a surprise attack came, they would have little warning. As Southerners slept, Northerners marched. Surprise was essential, and both Lyon and Sigel's columns marched with orders to maintain strict silence.
On we marched in dead silence. Smoking was prohibited. No commands were given aloud. A subdued, undelible clanking of our arms and the rumbling of our artillery carriages being the only sounds emanating from our column.
Everything was going to plan, but to those around him, General Lyon seemed lost in thought.
On the way to the field, I frequently rode near him. He seemed like one bewildered, and often when addressed, failed to give any recognition and seemed totally unaware that he was spoken to.
As the sun began to color the horizon on Saturday morning, August 10th, Lyon and Sigel never had a better chance to destroy the sleeping rebel army. They marched most of the night, resting for a few hours 2 miles north of the southern camps. By 5 a.m., their surprise attack was all but assured. Saturday, August 10th, began like most others for the Short family. Elias and Rebecca Short had lived at Wilson's Creek for years, raising 4 boys and 2 girls, Sarah and Samantha. Together they built a good farm in peace and quiet. Then the Western Army came over the hill. The rebels raided their land for food and forced the women and children to cook for the officers. By the morning of the 10th, all they had left was a single chicken. It was still dark when the family rose for breakfast and the morning chores. But the day brought something new entirely: Union skirmishers, the first of many hundreds more. The Civil War had arrived in Missouri.
We were finishing up our cold breakfast and hot coffee. Just then, there was an awful explosion across Wilson Creek.
At dawn, Lyon's battery of 6 and 12-pound cannons opened fire, followed shortly after by Sigel's battery, positioned in Farmer Sharp's field.
We presented our morning compliments to the Confederate cavalry below us in the shape of a half-dozen shells. Gracious, how the boys tumbled out of their blankets and struck a beeline for the nearest wood.
The execution of Sigel's plan was a success, and the combined barrage pinned down the men in the valley below, allowing Lyon's column to move atop the rise overlooking the southern camp. It was called Oak Hill by the locals, but by the end of the day, it would have a new name: Bloody Hill. Near sunrise, John Ray's children, out tending their horses, had been warned by a passing rider to take cover.
Just as Father was telling Mother not to be alarmed, all of us saw what appeared to be a black line, an army of marching men. Mother got all of the children lined up and hustled them together into the cellar.
This year, John Ray's 80-acre cornfield would yield a different sort of harvest. Minutes later, another messenger tried to warn Price and McCullough, but the news came from General James Raines, who lacked credibility.
You can tell General Raines when I've finished my breakfast. Sir, I will come to the front myself and I will assess the situation.
A week earlier, his men had panicked in the face of Lyon's artillery at Doug Springs.
You can tell him I'll be there as soon as I finish my breakfast. Come on.
And thanks to the rolling hills and trees of the surrounding countryside, they found themselves in what was called an acoustic shadow, an area where sound is scattered and lost. They did not hear the artillery firing, just a short walk away. And so McCullough ignored the warning.
Cornbread is really good. My company.
It took a second messenger to confirm Lyon was upon them. Benjamin Rives' cavalry got its only warning when scores of men from the 1st Missouri began to swarm into his camp, sending his 600 men fleeing in 2 directions at once. Throughout the camp, chaos reigned, and with Price and McCullough both absent, there was no leadership. Wilson's Creek was turning into another Boonville, except for one group that acted without orders. Just a short walk from where the Ray family now hid, Omer Weaver and his men of the Pulaski Battery had a clear view of James Totten's cannons firing atop Bloody Hill. And they could see he was completely exposed. On their own initiative, the battery opened fire, pinning down the Federals and drawing their fire away from the camps below, buying the Southerners precious time to organize and retaliate.
For a few moments, I thought we had won the fight almost before we had begun it. But just then I saw the rebel camp fairly vomiting forth regiment after regiment, until it seemed as if there was no end of men coming against us. And then I changed my mind.
Meanwhile, General Price arrived in the field, riding so close to the battle line he could see General Lyon. 7 weeks earlier, they sat at the same table trying to prevent a fight. Now each sought to wipe out the other. 2,000 men stood atop Bloody Hill, faced with several thousand more preparing to take it from them. At 6:30, Lyon called the 1st Kansas and 1st Missouri up to the battle lines, leaving a full half of his men in reserve. There was little coordination, and in a crucial blunder, each marched a different way around the tree-filled ravine on Bloody Hill, cutting them off from each other. The Missouri State Guardsmen had but two orders: wait till they could see the whites of their eyes and aim for their belt buckles.
Our first volley was delivered at 40 yards. At this distance, a musket or a shotgun was a terrible weapon. I noticed two men who, in their death agony, had torn their clothing from their front. One had 6 bullets in his abdomen and chest, and the other had 4.
Then a Southern charge began, though no one remembered who started it. The 1st Missouri fell back, and the Kansans followed. The two regiments became entangled. The Missourians' Lieutenant Colonel George Andrews' horse was shot out from under him. Only one Northern contingent made it across Wilson's Creek. 300 U.S. regulars and 200 loyal Missouri Unionists marched to guard the left side of Lyon's battle line. Their commander, Captain Joseph Plummer, was a Mexican war vet, but never saw combat due to illness. Now, he had his chance to shine. As they pressed toward Wire Road, the main pathway for the Southern troops, Plummer spotted the Pulaski Battery and determined to knock it out. First, he had to pass through Farmer Ray's cornfield. To counter this move, General McCulloch sent forward Arkansas rebels and the Louisiana Regiment that would become his shock troops at Wilson's Creek. McCulloch's Southerners outnumbered the Northerners 3-1, but the thick corn obstructed the view, and when Plummer's men emerged, both sides were caught off guard. Then the Southerners charged, sending the disorganized Union men into a retreat back to Bloody Hill and leaving Captain Plummer wounded. Two hours after the first shots were fired, Lyon's assault had stalled, and he was stuck on Bloody Hill. Casualties were mounting, and soon everyone was asking the same question. Where was Franz Sigel? After their successful attack on the Southern camp, Sigel's Germans halted on the Sharp farm, taking several dozen prisoners. They claimed that Lyon was winning on Bloody Hill. A lull in the noise around 8 a.m. seemed to confirm it. But with their army split, Sigel had no direct communication with Lyon. So he waited, arraying his Germans in a very vulnerable position, and began making confused decisions. At one point, he madly asked where his artillery had gone.
Lieutenant Schaefer got angry and said, "Why, Colonel Sigel, 10 minutes ago you ordered me to take 2 guns over there and open fire." Colonel Sigel, with a rattled look in his face, said, "Did I? I, as a young acting lieutenant, thought it was very strange of a commanding officer to dispose of 1/3 of his artillery and in 10 minutes forget all about it."
McCulloch plainly saw he had a tactical edge on Sigel. He quickly put together an attack to be spearheaded again by the Louisianians. At this early point in the Civil War, neither side had formally adopted the familiar Union blue or Confederate gray colors. They all wore whatever they could get, which for many of Lyon's volunteers were gray militia uniforms. And when Sigel saw the 3rd Louisiana charging toward him, he assumed they were Lyon's Greyhounds, the 1st Iowa, and ordered his men to hold fire. With his artillery scattered and many of his men preoccupied with guarding their prisoners, disaster was now upon them.
The artillery horses rushed into our infantry column, and we instantly were a big crowd of men, horses, guns, and caissons, all mixed together, all running to the south.
Sigel's Germans were quickly beaten, their artillery captured. Many, including Lieutenant Loddeman, would soon be taken prisoner. Those who remained would spend the rest of the battle straggling back to Springfield, with Colonel Sigel leading the way. After the botched charge on the southern camp, General Lyon was deadlocked on Bloody Hill.
Soon after reaching the summit of the hill, the front came upon a large body of the enemy, who were concealed in the grass and brush. The bullets rattled around us and through our ranks like hail.
In my company was a great, brawny-fisted, big-hearted fellow by the name of Moody. He had protected, befriended, and shielded me on many an occasion. I looked up to and loved him as an older brother. A short time after we had opened fire, I noticed Moody suddenly wheel about, then fall over on his hands and knees. I could not realize that my great, strong friend was hurt. The next moment, the truth flashed over me. He was shot.
Men on both sides were soon to discover that war chose no favorites, had no political ties, no loyalties. Young and talented Omar Weaver would discover this fact as a shell struck him, nearly severing his arm. By 8 a.m., the charge had pulled back, and an uneasy silence fell upon the field. It was that silence that fooled Colonel Sigel into complacency. As the sun went higher, so did the temperature. With the creek in enemy hands, available water grew scarce, and even the regulars began to strip to their shirt sleeves to keep cool.
Our boys were dressed in such a motley fashion that it was impossible for a person to tell our side whether we were Federal or Rebel.
The casualty rate skyrocketed. Officers were in short supply, and ready troops were stretched thin. By 9 o'clock, even General Lyon had been wounded twice. His horse killed. Though his men had held their own for hours, he told an aide that he was afraid that they was lost.
They contested the ground inch by inch. Here was witnessed some of the most heroic valor displayed during this trying war. It was Western men accustomed to outdoor life and hardships, engaging other Western men just as brave, just as heroic, and just as fearless and determined as themselves.
I drew a fine bead on a belt plate. Just as my finger was contracting on the trigger, I received a terrible blow. Blood was freely flowing from my right breeches pocket, coursing down into my shoes. I found in my right groin a hole about the size of a dime.
The Southerners made another advance on the hill. Major John Schofield, Lyon's chief of staff, urged them to go on, to make one more try. With renewed confidence and a borrowed horse, Lyon brought up the 2nd Kansas Infantry to plug a gap in his lines, shouting, Come on, my brave boys. I will lead you forward. Some would later say his last words were, I am going. As though in death, he was finally ready to give up. Others claimed he said, I am killed. As though he was shocked to find he was, in fact, mortal. Whatever he said, it matters little. The Civil War had claimed its first Union general. It was around 9:30 in the morning, August 10th, 1861. The Missouri State Guardsmen cheered the arrival of 1,000 fresh muskets as Arkansas troops extended the left end of their line. Around 10:30 that morning, 5,000 Southerners launched their third attack in a battle line 10 football fields long. Northern artillery made them pay dearly. Around 11 a.m., another lull descended upon Bloody Hill, providing just the opportunity the Northerners needed. With Lyon dead, Major Samuel Sturgis had assumed command. Ammunition was low. Canteens were empty. Every regimental commander had been wounded, and a survivor from Sigel's army had finally confirmed everyone's worst fear. Reinforcements weren't coming. Out of options and believing they had accomplished what they set out to do, Sturgis ordered the Northern Army to retreat to Springfield. In the midst of another attack, the Southerners were surprised to find Bloody Hill occupied by only the dead and the wounded. And as one Southern officer said, we watched the retreating enemy and were glad to see him go. It was morning still. The second major battle of the Civil War had lasted barely 6 hours. In farmer-raised corn, in Sharp's fields, on Bloody Hill, over 500 men lay dead. Another 1,800 were wounded, many maimed for life. McCulloch and Price's Southerners lost 12% of all engaged killed or wounded. Lyon's Northerners, an astonishing 24%, nearly 1 out of every 4. Somehow, Thomas Bacon had managed to stop the flow of blood from his wound. Now he found himself in a field of the dead.
Their lips were blots of livid purple, their faces pallid yellow, their eyes like lamps gone out. The August light glared down on their faces. It is a sin, each face did say. It is a sin to shine on me so. Let me be out of man's sight. My life was sweetly yielded, and I am done. O humanity, give me my grave.
When the Ray family emerged from their shelter, they found their home, their land, had become a massive hospital. Roxana and the girls began to give care and comfort to Northern and Southern men alike.
The fair sex, God bless them. They're doing all they can in the way of cooking, serving, and nursing.
But for others, it was too late. For Omer Weaver, regarded by his commander to be the most promising young officer in the Western Army, he had bled to death several hours earlier. Farmer Sharp and his wife emerged to find their crops trampled, their property damaged by Union artillery, and their grounds littered with the wounded. She claimed her husband was deaf from the noise and asked who would pay for the damages. Said one soldier, Considering our gift of speech, a worse thing might have happened to the old man. And on top of the scores of wounded, there were the hundreds of dead on the field of battle. Underneath the sweltering August sun,
the process was toilsome and got on slowly. By the early part of the forenoon, the sun got intensely hot, and some of the bodies began to show signs of decomposition. The flies became intolerable.
A week later, they were still burying the dead. It got to be so bad that the Southerners soon began burying their own first and leaving the remaining to rot. It was going to be a long war indeed. One body received special treatment. General Lyon's remains had been accidentally left behind during the Federal retreat. It was delivered to the Ray home, where it was carefully covered and placed in the Ray family bed, while scores of wounded lay on the dirt outside. In death, Nathaniel Lyon became a martyr for the Union cause. As his body traveled by rail from Rolla, Missouri, to his home state of Connecticut, President Lincoln called for a national day of prayer and fasting in his honor. The tiny community that inhabited Wilson's Creek was never the same. The Short family, who managed to flee before the battle began, returned to find their home littered with dead horses and Union soldiers. A month after, they were still finding grim reminders of that battle in their fields. Water contaminated by the dead on both sides gave rise to an epidemic of typhoid, which claimed both Short daughters within a year. As much as the Sharps prospered before the war, so they suffered during it. Later in the war, their farmhouse burned to the ground. And in 1863, Joseph was briefly imprisoned on suspicion of being disloyal. They moved away from Wilson's Creek shortly thereafter. John and Roxana Ray defiantly remained at Wilson's Creek until their deaths in 1875 and 1876. Today, their home is a popular tourist attraction on the Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. The Battle of Wilson's Creek was over. For many who fought it, the war was over too. They returned home having had their taste of war. 5 Union men received medals of honor for their actions there. Though all were bestowed decades after the fact. For the veterans under Price and McCulloch, there were no medals. Such was the price of not picking the winning side.
To Mrs. Hattie Jones, Olathe, Kansas. Dear Madam, it becomes my painful duty to inform you of the death of your husband, Levant Jones. The night before the fight, Jones said, "If I go under, I want you to write to Hattie and tell her my last thought was for her."
Omer Weaver's body was borne to Little Rock, Arkansas in an elaborate metal casket to a hero's welcome. As for his sweetheart Annie, nothing more, not even her last name is known about her. Their mutual efforts to keep their affection a secret has won throughout the decades. Those who survived returned home as heroes. In Iowa, one community spent days preparing a grand welcome, only to find out that their boys would be 2 days late. Others took up a collection to buy them new uniforms. However, they were still gray. The Germans, once reviled and discriminated against by their neighbors, were now the toast of St. Louis.
An abundance of everything to eat was free to them, and no saloon in town would charge a cent for beer to a soldier who had fought mit Siegel.
In Emporia, Kansas, it seemed the homecoming celebration would never end. But then, the men of the 2nd Kansas unveiled their battle flag for all to see.
We saw it full of bullet holes, ragged and battle-stained. Reverend Fairchild pointed to the dark stains on the staff where the blood of our brave young soldiers had trickled down. We sobbed and cried aloud. It was our first experience of the horrors of war.
Though they'd won the battle at Wilson's Creek, Price and McCulloch could not agree on their next step and lost their advantage. Price left McCulloch in southwest Missouri and marched with the Missouri State Guard to capture Lexington in September 1861. But the twin defeats of Wilson's Creek and Lexington and the death of General Lyon convinced the Lincoln administration that greater Union involvement was needed in Missouri. A new Union army marched into Arkansas and scored a decisive victory over Price and McCulloch at Pea Ridge in March 1862. Thereafter, the Confederacy would never establish a permanent foothold in Missouri. Though he had lost the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Missouri remained firmly in Union control, thanks to Nathaniel Lyon.
That we were whipped and on a retreat never entered my mind for a moment. We had not gone over 300 yards when a soldier remarked, "Yonder's Moody, and he's alive." Without a moment's hesitation, I sprang out of the ranks and ran to him. He urged me to leave him and join the command, otherwise I would be captured. A troop of rebel cavalry came sweeping by. At the suggestion of Moody, I threw myself down beside him and feigned death. He again told me to go. I sadly took his hand and bade him goodbye. I never saw him again.
The battle's dead remain here at the Springfield National Cemetery. The casualties at Wilson's Creek, only the second major battle of the Civil War, shocked the North and the South. For the remainder of the war, Missouri civilians were caught in the crosshairs of invading armies and ruthless guerrilla warfare. In almost every corner of the state, the Civil War brought sadness, loss, and despair. As a result, Missouri ranks third among all states with the greatest number of Civil War battles and engagements. The war here, as one rebel described Wilson's Creek, was a mighty, mean-fought fight.